Well, good morning, everybody. Sorry for the slight delay. We had a couple things we were working out. I hope everyone is having a wonderful Friday, early, mid morning, whatever it is for the time frame that you're in. We are engaging in what I think will be a really fun and interesting Bible study. We're starting it off today. Chris Emerson has joined us. We'll talk to Chris in just a second. Terry's here in his undisclosed location bunker, as always. And we're going to be looking at the Corinthian Correspondence, the letters that Paul writes to the church at Corinth. And as we do that, my hope is that we can kind of interact with the historical record of a congregation that is pretty amazing. A lot of folks look at the Church of Corinth as the cross the tracks congregation of the New Testament that no one wants to go to, no one wants to be part of, and yet Paul is deeply connected to them. I will tell you that I think Corinth is probably one of the most exciting, vibrant churches in the New Testament in many ways, especially because we get to see, unlike some of the other ones, transformation of the group. We see a lot of individual transformations in the text, but the group itself transforms through the course of the interactions with Paul, with Timothy, and others. So before we get into our overview, which is really going to introduce both the first and second letter today, let's take a second and just see how everyone's doing. Chris, what's it like in Texas right now? How are you doing?
Doing great. It is nice. We got a little front that came through yesterday, a little rain, and now it's probably around 50 degrees. I can see it's very windy though. The golf balls will be moving left and right here in just a little while. Overall, pretty good though.
Yeah, I was going to ask you what your golf experience has been like lately, but you just already went ahead and stepped ahead of the conversation. Terry, you good?
Well, I imagine Chris's pace of play is pretty good right now. You're probably not having to wait on very many people, are you? It's
This is true.
pretty nice. It's good to be with you guys, and of course, we want to continue to plug Chris's work. Excel Still More, great podcast. If you're not listening to that, you really should. And I know that's helped out a lot of people, especially during this time. Chris, thanks for keeping that up and seeing some of your posts, and appreciate your work that helps people out just like we're trying to do, and appreciate you taking time out to join us today before your tea time. So looking forward to this. Like you, Phil, I think the church at Corinth is not just exciting. I think it's one of the best examples for a church for us today. And I know that's probably the opposite of what people think, but from the fact that they, from what we'll see, obviously had an awareness of what some of their struggles were. I mean, there's some that Paul points out, but there's some that they've obviously realized are problems they need some suggestions, answers, solutions to. And I think that's pretty powerful in itself, because I think in so many cases today, we're kind of blinded to those kind of things. We kind of think that we have it all figured out. But not only that they corresponded with Paul about that. And as we get into the study, we'll see that more. But then in the second letter, it's obvious, and especially in the case, I think, of chapter 5, with really that kind of text case of like, wow, this church is really messed up. In that second letter, Paul comes back and says, hey, good job. You guys listen to what you said. So not only did this church know they had problems, ask for answers, but as you said, they transformed based on what Paul wrote them, and they became a much better version of themselves. And it's just so encouraging to see that. And by the way, the other thing is, if we were in the neighboring town, this is the church we would talk about. This is the place we go. Well, you know what they say about the church in Corinth, right? Mm-hmm. And I just think I think it's almost a centerpiece congregation for the New Testament, to kind of show us what good hearts look like in a collective sense.
Yeah, if I could just add to that before Philip jumps in, I love what you're saying there in terms of how we would consider them to be very different than us, and yet they're very similar. People look at the trouble in Corinth and they would label it this church that nobody would associate with, and yet when you look at the city of Corinth and the cultural mix, the melting pot, the prosperity, it is not unlike what our culture is here. Lots of money and prosperity and freedom, and yet this idea of multi-worship sources and different things. And, when you look at this church, and it's easy to look at your local church and say, we've got it together. This church is a mess. But that kind of pride has caused a lot of problems. In fact, sometimes the pride for your local church causes more problems than the problems that another church has, as long as they're being honest about it. Yeah. And so I look at this. Yeah, I know we probably don't have anybody who's in a relationship with his father's wife, but it's just immorality. And we do have immorality issues. I think an honest look at, I love the way you said that, how similar this church was to us will help us, because as we're going to talk about today, they ended up doing great. They just had to listen and learn. So love that introduction.
So there's a couple of things I think are important. In our James study, we were really in Jerusalem a lot, and then the surrounding confines of the Galilean area, and tying deeply into the imagery of Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. James, like we said a couple times, was the Cliff Notes or the expanded edition, however Ed you want to look at, to the Sermon on the Mount in some ways in that specific context. And so everything was Israel. With the Corinthian letters, Israel takes the back seat. They're there. The cultural Israel is there. The complications of idolatry are there that come from a mixed congregation. So we're going to have some of that too. We have to take a moment now and kind of shift our perspective. And like Terry and Chris have pointed out, think about a church where we wouldn't send our college kids to go visit.
Yeah.
No.
Well,
you can't go to Cornell University. Sorry, you can't do that, son.
And I think it needs to be pointed out, it wasn't just the church. Like, you wouldn't want your kids going to this town.
Right.
I mean, the thing is, and I think it's interesting to kind of point out that when this letter is written, Corinth, the rebuilt version of Corinth under the Roman Empire, is what, probably about 100 years old. And in the process of that, it's been repopulated with people from everywhere. And it's got a very diverse background. I was reading this morning, I think there's maybe you guys have a solid number, but there was well over a dozen different gods that were being worshipped in Corinth. We hear about the one temple because of their immoral practices, but there were a lot of temples that were there. And then you and then you have we talk about in the Old Testament that the term, Jared Saltz talks about the term the Moabitess, referring to a woman with a poor reputation. A Corinthian woman was a New Testament version of that. A Corinthian woman was kind of known to be a prostitute in a lot of ways. So you just think about a town like that and sending your kid to that town. And then with the church like this is the blacklist of places to send your young people. All of us as preachers would be like, don't know anywhere else. It's, I think we can all agree. It's kind of like, sending your kid to USC or something like that, because we're all Southern guys right now. So we'll pick on the West Coast. I started to say Alabama, but my own members would lynch me. Or not lynch, sorry. They would be mad at me.
Regrettable speech number 1 by Terry. Let me write that down.
Yeah, there's more to come. But again, just the point is, we don't, this is not a good place from all of our standards today.
Yeah.
Well, if we did that, I guess a lot of preachers have their intro to 1 Corinthians. I'm sure every preacher has his opening where you don't tell them where you're studying. You just say, let me tell you about a church. Let me tell you about a church, been around 5 or 10 years. They've had some great preachers in the past, but now there's some really interesting things going on there. They're being baptized in other people's names, and they're segregating. They're suing each other. There's immorality in their midst. The Lord's Supper is this divided partisan service, on and on throughout this section. They're confused on this, that, and the other. And you would say, what is the likelihood that you would ever go there? And people would say, well, never again, only once. And we'd write up articles about them, get them blacklisted, and talk about how unsound they were. And I know you guys are going to talk about this in your series. I mean, clearly they had sin that they had to fix. And if they didn't change, then yes, their lampstand most definitely would have been removed. But this idea of just seeing problems in a church and deciding that is not a place that is worthy of my effort or my prayers or my attention. I mean, get your Bible open to 1 Corinthians and read it. He opens, and I hope we get to talk about this today. He opens in the first 9 verses, and are you ready for this? It almost sounds like he's writing to saved people. Be careful. It almost sounds like they're Christians, they're brethren. Yeah, they're an heir. They've got problems. They were young. And he didn't go in and try to just photocopy every church to them like, hey, you need to become like us. He just taught the truth of the wisdom of God. And I think that until you get the right attitude towards churches, the attitude Paul had towards this church, all we're going to do is end up labeling one another to death.
Right. So let's talk about three things that I think are important for today. One, we're going to talk a little about Corinth as a city. Two, we're going to talk about Paul as an author, writer, evangelist, apostle, and then their interactions. The third thing is how do they meet, interact, and some timeline stuff a little bit, some structures in the text itself that help us figure out the what, where, when, why, who question model, if you will. So Corinth. Corinth is located on the isthmus that connects southern Greece to the region we call Achaia. And it's about 5 miles across. It serves as, you can think of it as a variation of the Panama Canal, but other means to get across. And so most of us are familiar with that concept of we want to shortcut something. And so that's where Corinth kind of has its situation there. As a consequence of that location, its economic geography says everything should come through here. It grows like crazy. It becomes populated. It has its own edition of the Olympic Games. It has 12 to 20 different deities of significance, depending on when you're looking at their existence. It then also has some physical structures that are imposing in the area. 1,800-foot, Acropolis, Temple to Venus, a number of other things. And that gives us kind of like a little top hits level of the text background for Corinth. Wealthy, diverse spiritually, situated as a hub for all the regions. It's going to have a constant flow of people there, which for an evangelist is like catnip. Oh, yeah, lots of people? I get to talk to lots of people? And they're all over the place, and they might go somewhere else and bring the message that I brought to them somewhere else. I mean, like, it's really like a hotbed of evangelism in that sense, from my perspective, seeing it. Before we get to Paul, though, what else do you guys see about Corinth that's important to introduce these letters?
And that was really well said. It makes me think of Caleb Churchill. You guys know Caleb. He moved up to the New York area. And when you talk to him about that, he's excited about the potential. Most of us evangelistically, we're looking for saved people to save. Find me somebody who comes from my background, who knows what I know, who's done what I've done. I'd really like to baptize that person. Of course, that person's already a Christian. And then you have Caleb saying, no, I'm going to go to an area where they know almost nothing of God, and they've been influenced by worldliness from every angle. And that's what I see as well in Corinth. He shows up there, we're going to talk about the dates, maybe 51, 52 AD, in his second journey. And he just sees all this opportunity, and he stays there, a year and a half, couple of years teaching. And look at what happens. This church comes together and they grow. And do they have problems? Yeah. It's like, evangelistically, we want to find someone with almost no problems. Find me a church and a community with almost no problems. And yet they had lots of issues here. But yeah, I think you're right. It's all about the attitude. Paul's attitude approaching this city is what we need. And the Corinthians, who are now in a place of joy and peace with God because of Paul's attitude at the beginning, and when he wrote the first letter, and when he wrote the second letter, they're enjoying eternity where maybe most of the people would have never even shown up in this city. So I just love the attitude of the approach evangelistically as well.
Terry?
Yeah, and one of the things about Corinth that I think really stands out, and you talked about it's, being a hub and all of that, is it was kind of the place you went to in that area if you wanted to get ahead. I mean, the ability to financially be successful in Corinth was really great compared to a lot of other places because of their position as the capital of the region, as right there, that central hub, very transient. And because of that, you had a very competitive social society that even had a pretty active hierarchy of elites and versus the non-elite, and competitivism, and the haves and the have-nots. And I think that's really important to see because, especially in these first couple of chapters, that's really kind of provides us, I think, an explanation or a window, foundation for what we see of all the divisions within the church. And that really, I think, becomes even more magnified when you get to chapters 12 through 14 and you see this conflict that exists over who has what spiritual gifts and what's better versus what's not. it's really easy to see how that social kind of practice of elitism and competitiveness and this kind of culture of getting ahead and taking advantage of each other really just translated so well into what they did as a church. And that was really based on the culture they grew up in. I found this quote by Carter, which I thought was pretty interesting. It said that the church's culture fits the model of a highly egocentric, individualistic, and competitive society dominated by the big man who imposes himself as a leader and who derives prestige and power from the size of his following. And I just think if you take that quote, that idea that here's the big man who develops the following, and and some of that was purely unintentional. Like those people who said, I am of Paul and I'm of Apollos, I don't think either Paul or Apollos were the big men trying to derive that following, but that happened as a natural response to this culture they grew up in. And the last quote I shared with you guys earlier, which I thought was really great, was that Fee said in his commentary, the problem was not the church was in Corinth, but that too much of Corinth was in the church. And I think that just really gives a great kind of explanation. And by the way, that's the same thing with us today. I mean, just to be practical, the problem's not where our churches are located. It's just that we let too much of our culture outside of what the Bible says dictate who we are, what we are, and how we act. And so what you see in them is the same thing you see in us in that sense.
So first of all, when you were looking up just then, it looked like you were drawing from your memory banks and you were just quoting that whole thing. And then I
was looking above the camera at Logos, but
okay, it's pretty good. Just don't add all the details. I know Philip's going to get into this in a bit, but when you get into 1 Corinthians, the first 3 chapters, that's why before he can even talk about their issues, he has to talk about their culture, where he mentions, I'm just in 1 Corinthians 1 right now, and you look at verse 18, for the word of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing, but to us who are being saved, it is the power of God. There was this whole idea that wisdom was found in self. It was found in culture. It was found in historical observation. It wasn't found in Jesus. And by the way, that's very difficult for us to understand. I live in East Texas. I mean, I guess almost everybody here considers themselves to be a Christian. They almost all have some connection to Christ. Easter Sunday's coming up. This culture was very different than that. This was, most of the people there would have said, Jesus who? And how could one person be the great wisdom of God when God is accessible in so many ways, through so many different gods and so many different angles? And until he got them to see that the wisdom of the world at its finest is a speck compared to the universe of the wisdom of God through Christ, he couldn't help them fix any of their problems. I love your quote. When the worldliness of the city got into the church broke. When Jesus elevated himself and pushed out all of the foolishness of the world, the solutions came pretty quickly after that. So I think that's a great way of explaining it.
Yeah, I think there's some important, keys, and this is the one thing I try to point out, especially as we begin this. No matter where you live in the United States, you essentially live in Corinth. It doesn't matter if you are living in the spiritual comfort of North Alabama, as we sometimes think about the proliferation of churches there, or you're living in Alaska, and you feel like you're alone. Because of the interconnected nature of our media lives and the interconnection nature of our cultural lives, Corinth isn't just a one-time thing. It's now. And it's the communities we live in, even with the veneer of sameness, because we're struggling with all these kind of spiritual issues. We still have idolatry. We still have sexual immorality. We still have disparity of leadership. Paul applies to himself figuratively the picture, and Apollos figuratively, of those who are saying, I am of Paul, I am of Apollos. They weren't actually saying those things. They were saying, he was writing them and saying, look, this is how you're behaving. You're acting this way when you should be saying, I am of Christ. They have their own leaders who are not necessarily specified at that context point. And so I think there's a big, powerful shift that we can do to refocus our hearts and say, why would Paul go back there and invest in them a second time? Because right now we're going to look at Paul. Paul's pretty an amazing guy in and of itself. He goes on, we talk about his 3 missionary journeys a lot. We use that as a moniker. But Paul had his own journey before that. His first journey is the journey from Saul to Paul. And it is probably more dynamic, more far-ranging than the other 3 times we kind of categorize his work. That transformation process he goes through where he becomes self-aware. I love the illustration in the text, why you kick against the goats. I think that's like the most powerful way to talk about, well, sometimes I feel like I'm that guy. Like that's me. You self-harm yourself, your physical form, your spiritual form, because you're so stubborn you won't do what God is telling you to do. And that's basically Saul at that point. So in that transition, we say, okay, now who do we have here? So before we get into when he meets Corinth, which is our next step, what do we know about Paul or Saul at each of those points that's relevant for us understanding this interaction?
I'll take a shot at it, and then Terry can bring the wisdom. When you look at Saul's life, he talks about how he always honors his conscience. I mean, when this guy has more information, he acts on that information. I never saw him as a person who got the right information and then rejected it out of principle or tradition or history. And so that's what makes his story so beautiful is he's a man with the right heart and the wrong information. And when he learned the truth about Jesus and the cross, he pushed out the way of the world. And I think that's why his attitude towards Corinth is so good. He enters the city for the first time. There may be some good-hearted people there. There were. They don't know the truth. And so he introduces the truth. Does he convert the whole city? No, but he converts many. Then he finds out from the letter that he receives that, they still have a lot of worldliness in them. Like that whole idea of I am of this and I am of that, that's partisanship they learned in their culture. I mean, they didn't learn that from Christ, but they learned it from their culture. So he comes back and says, let's see if you're really good-hearted people, if you're really honest and you honor your conscience, let's see what truth can do. Let's just pile truth in and see if it pushes out the foolishness of the world. And we know from the 2 Corinthian letter, largely it did. I don't want to act like the second letter said everything is fixed, but they were on the right track. And, that's his life. His life was a life of integrity. And I think that you talk about, well, what if a church is struggling? Should you write them off? Look, if you introduce truth and they say, we see it, we hear it, we don't want it, that's totally different. But unfortunately, we often write people off long before that. Most people would have never gone to Saul. This is not a Barnabas study today. That dude's awesome. Mm-hmm. And he wanted to see what truth could do. So anyway, I think that there's a real parallel between Saul's conversion with a good conscience, just needing more truth, and just really the Corinthian growth.
Terry?
Yeah, sure. I mean, we talked about yesterday with the boys in Philippians 3, and we looked at that section where he talks about all the things that he used to be that he gave up for in order to follow Christ, and ultimately for the resurrection, the things that he sacrificed. And so we kind of talked about that change from the past to the present. And I think Chris brings up a good point. I think Paul, knowing where he came from to where he was and what that took and the change involved, I think that does give him an insight and a connection here that is a beautiful thing to see and mirrors each other. And one of the things that, we talked about the division, the eye of Paul and the eye of Apollos and all that. And Chris just mentioned, I think one of the things that's most interesting about that partisanship is there was a group that Paul condemns that even said they were of Christ. And it wasn't because it's a bad thing to claim that you're following Christ. It's just the way they were saying that in the context he's using it was partisan and was a break of unity and fellowship. And just how much, I mean, even when people could be quote unquote doing all the right things, they can still do them in the wrong ways and even for wrong reasons. And you see that here as well. And I just think that even is a mirror of Paul. I mean, he did the wrong things, but with a very zealous heart before he learned the truth. And I do think there is, maybe we don't see here as much. I do think there is a zeal among these brethren that we may overlook because of all their problems. And I think it's that zeal, by the way, and that love, I think for the Lord, ultimately, that's the reason why Paul could change and become who he was versus who he was. Who he is versus who he was. And that's also why Corinth could change ultimately, was because of their zeal and love for the Lord. And I just think that's something that maybe we overlook here in the story of this church.
So a couple things. I'm going to pull in some comments from the chat feed real quick. Hal Hammonds mentions, I think my brethren and I rationalize our carnality more than the Corinthians did. Michael Walls has a couple comments. One of them, arte excellence, being a great person by being generous, heroic, wise, is the Greek equivalent of good person. It was never about morality. And secondly, he says, when is everything ever fixed in a given congregation? Both very two accurate statements. Tim Beckley says, although we have a whole lot of Corinthian challenges, true, I would think that we also have an abundant selection of Ephesian issues as well. No doubt.
Sure.
The smorgasbord of what's wrong in our individual levels of growth is an entire buffet of possibilities. And we just go from one bad Chinese buffet to another. It feels like
we have a lot of Corinthian issues, Ephesians issues, Galatians issues. I mean, all those letters are there for a reason, right? Romans issues. We got a lot of issues from all of those places.
Yeah, my issues have issues.
Yes.
Yeah.
But I'm hoping to go record an episode for Monday called Hope Springs Eternal. I just don't skip the first 9 verses of chapter 1. I just want to say this again. I get it. Yeah. A mess. His attitude, optimistic, hopeful, positive. He anticipated and expected that they would listen. He argued well from scripture. And I just love it. I love the way he approached it. And there are people who would not have written the first Corinthian letter, the first chapter, the way that Paul did. Attitude is crucial to helping people, because we got to find out, are they poor-hearted people who are ignoring the truth? Or are they good-hearted people who are sinning, still sin? They just need a better education. They need more information. Like I think about when the man had his father's wife in 1 Corinthians 5. And the real indictment of chapter 5 is not the man. It's the church. Yeah, they were what? They were arrogant. They were accepting him. You know what? They probably thought they were doing the right thing. We accept him. We work through this. He's a young Christian. Let's find out. Let's find out if they're acting on conscience or if they're actually ignoring the truth. Well, how do you figure that out? You write a letter and you tell them, here's the truth. You're actually being arrogant and you're counterintuitive to the truth. And you know what they did? They changed, and he changed, and everybody changed. Yeah. And I just think that we need to give everybody that chance, to see how truth hits them.
Well, and I think one of the things to point out about what happens in chapter 5 is when you read 1 Corinthians 6 there in verses 9 through 11, what you learn is this church was filled with people with that kind of a background. So they were, because of their background, they're more sympathetic towards that man in chapter 5, I think. I think all those things are connected together, and they too are young, right? This is a church that's really what we would call in its kind of infantile stages. And so, I think there's a lot of, for lack of a better term, ignorance in how they handled that. But to their credit, here's a thing, a situation Paul hears about. He writes back. He says, "Here's what you do," and they did that. And they did that really zealously, because in chapter 6, in the second epistle, he basically has to come back and say, "Okay, now here's what you got to do." When we get to that, when we get there. But you've done a good job on what I told you back in chapter 5 of the first letter. But now I need you to do this because what you did worked, and now here's how you respond again. I just think it's interesting to see how all that connects together and how all that works together.
Yeah, I think there's a great opportunity for us as believers to be encouraging in the text by looking at Paul. We think of Barnabas, the son of encouragement, and he's the only encourager, and Paul is the big meanie. When they had different approaches to get to the same outcome. Paul was absolutely an encourager of his own kind. And you think about the good that he did for brethren that no one else would go spend time with. Partly an obvious opportunity to think about it is because that was him. He saw himself in the midst of all of that. And I'll make a side note. I'll probably make another plea for this at the end of the study for today too. Pause for a moment and think about someone you wrote off in your past, and for whatever reason, they're like, oh, they're not going to listen. They don't listen. They're spiritually malformed or whatever. And ask yourself, did you genuinely reach out to them a second time? Or did you try to throw a rock at their house a second time? Another screed email isn't going to fix it, but maybe sitting down on the phone and just telling them you're sorry for the distance will be helpful. I'll say some more at the end. I'll get off the pulpit there in a second. But before we go into Paul's thing, last comments here, we're going to talk about when Paul will meet these brethren next.
Well, just to put together some of how the letters worked, it really resonates with what you're saying. He goes in and he establishes the church. And then a handful of years later, he finds that there are problems. He's probably on his third missionary journey. and he wants to go there. But when he goes, he knows he's going to have to stand for the truth, and he knows there's going to be some whips and tables flipping. So instead of walking in, he writes the first letter and he addresses them. And then he gets feedback that says, hey, that went pretty well, but maybe there's a little more they could learn. So before he gets there, he writes them a second letter. He's doing everything he can to introduce truth without this kind of confrontation. Of course, they're immature, and some of them come in and say, well, his letters are all weighty and he's mean, but when he shows up, he's different. He said, yeah, that's the plan. The plan is, let me just give you truth and information, and you get it. So when I get there, we don't have to have these massive debates. We don't have to fight. We can just enjoy each other. He wanted them to have unity. So his letters were intent to try to create that outcome. I do wonder, from a preaching and leadership perspective, if people address the sin in other churches toward the right outcome. His outcome was, I want to show up and us be in perfect fellowship, whether we're apart or together. So I'm going to write these letters. I'm not real sure that's why people chastise churches and other Christians now. I think it's almost more, let me find out where they are so I can label how wrong they are. His intent is crucial all the way through this process. And that's why he wrote these letters before he got there, to try to make it better.
Yeah. I think there's a lot of that there. Certainly on a modern application side, that we've adopted a model of distancing, maybe our own little spiritual distancing programs that are really kind of flawed, rather than spiritual unity, which is what Paul's big desire was, that they be of one mind, that they be fellows on a ship together in fellowship with one another. I think there's a powerful picture there. So,
well, let me ask you a question real quick. I mean, in a sense, in areas like where I am, where there's so many churches, and I don't know, let me preface this by saying, I don't think this is with evil intent necessarily. I think sometimes it could be. But don't you think sometimes as churches, we're a lot like these brethren? We just don't meet at the same place, but I'm of this church and I'm of that church. And we have these kind of divisions that exist, and we propagate those for a variety of reasons. And sometimes I think the reasons aren't necessarily bad. Sometimes the reasons are truthfully out of competitiveness and trying to prove which church is better. Just like in Corinth, it was this group versus that group versus this group. I mean, when you apply this beyond just the local body, but to a group of local bodies in an area, I'm not so sure that we're any better in some regards than the way Paul describes these folks in the first 3 or 4 chapters. And, I think that's one of the reasons why we talked about on Do the Work months ago, Phil, the idea of church consolidation and merging and how rare that is. And I just think that's a testimony to the fact that we still have some of these issues at play here. When you go to a town of, like I've lived near, of 10 to 15,000 people, and there's 4 churches of 50 or less, but they refuse to come together because this is my church and this is my church. How's that any better than these first 4 chapters in that sense?
I got to say this again. You're so right. Thank you. Keep drawing attention to the first 3 chapters. We can't fix any of that unless the cross elevates itself and Christ crucified becomes the centerpiece of our life. His one church, not his local churches. His one church, his one message pushes out all of the competitiveness. Your word is a perfect word. The jealousy. I'll go ahead and push that needle a little bit further. The idea of local church success and failure in the separate model, until we get, that's worldly. That's the way the world behaves. Turn on your television and watch the election stuff. Until we get the foolishness of the world out, we can have debates, we can write articles, we can argue points. Nobody's listening if the world is dominating it. I just want to say again, and I mentioned this a couple of times, we know a lot about 1 Corinthians, but until you get this wisdom foolishness, can I plug something? I'm going to plug something, Phil. I'm plugging.
Plug away.
Plug away.
I'm moving a little bit from, we're still doing Excel Still More podcast once a week, but I'm really getting back into this color Bible marking, and we have a new series on color Bible marking. There's a Facebook page and all that stuff. But if you would mark wisdom in one color in chapters 1 through 4 and foolishness in another, something that's very contrasting, and then go back and decide, like, which one am I? Like, am I this fool, or am I into the world's wisdom or the true wisdom? Get those wires connected to the right places, and there's really nothing that you can't accomplish. But it always starts there.
So I'll add this, like the themes for these books that we've kind of like that I set out was First Corinthians is wisdom, and Second Corinthians is encouragement, because those are the understretched themes that really make these two letters have some sense to them. There is wisdom in First Corinthians that they need, that I need, that we need. Um, and I'll just continue to echo it. I think there's a picture that draws in a lot of folks' minds about all of these kind of issues of how do we view ourselves, and I'm going to start there, and how do we view other Christians or other congregations or clumpings of Christians. If we're talking about somebody else, we see them as the haters describe them, and the haters drive the picture. That's how we talk about Paul, weighty in letters. He's clearly not a good writer. But if we're talking about ourselves, we describe ourselves like our mom sees us, no blemishes. And so we've drawn two pictures. Neither of those are true. You're never as good as your mom thinks you are, and you're never as bad as your haters draw you out to be. Like, those are not realities. Because Paul will cite from first century poets and prophets of the cultural scene, I'll do that too. I kind of think about it this way, and this is a double tie-in because we get to use a mythological creature to pull it together. Thor to Loki, you could be so much more. You've got that dialogue context of the church in your community could be so much more. And I say the church rather than the local body of First Street, Second Street, 8th Street, whatever. Together they could be so much more. And I'm not even telling them to go worship together on the first day of the week. I'm saying together you could be so much more. I believe that's a biblical premise that Paul has in mind here. And once you figure that out, I will suggest that the only outcome is you stop worshiping on 1st Street, 2nd Street, and 8th Street, and you worship the Lord together. I'm biased that way. My bias is way out there. I think we've got way too many small fractured communities of believers in the United States.
If I could add just for a second to that, I'm going to say something perhaps controversial. It's mostly preachers who watch this, and half of them will message me on how wrong I am. But I don't think anywhere in the New Testament, even including 1 Corinthians 14, I don't think body is ever used of a local church. I think there is one body. There is one church. And, you would read something like 1 Corinthians and you'd read about the spiritual gifts in chapter 12, I should say, and you would say, well, body, and, it's our local church body. I don't see it. I see there is one body. Jesus is our king. His cross is our purpose. And all of us are in this together. And when we get that attitude, everything will change. But we don't often have that. Between churches, there's the Romans 14, weak and strong. Have you ever called yourself the weak one, by the way? I'm pretty sure I'm always the strong and they're always the weak. But in the one body, we're trying to strengthen everyone. And we make sacrifices and compromises for the other. And sometimes that is limited to the local church. I'm willing to do that at the Lindale Church. But when it comes to a church in another place, I would just rather just kind of label them and just stick with my own stuff. And I just think we need to think in terms of the body. I'll give you an example. My own self. I'll give you an example for me. Yesterday, I heard of one church in the Houston area still assembling normally on Sundays, even now. And I thought, well, first of all, they think they're better than us. They probably label us. So I'll label you first. I think you guys are foolish. And I think that you're being dangerous. You know what? Forget that. That night, I prayed that church be healthy, that they don't get sick, that it all work out fine, that they are my brothers and my sisters. And do I think I'm the weak one and they're the strong one, or they're the strong, I don't know. Why do I have to label it that way? They're operating to the best of their ability, but they are just as much my family when Christ and Christ crucified is our center as the people here in Lindale. And attitude is everything, as always.
Well, when we were talking about earlier about the divisions, that's one of the things that I thought too, is just right now, one of the side effects of this that's kind of bad is I think there's more tendency to judge each other right now during this difficult time based on what your congregation is doing. And it's interesting how much we talk about that, right? Like in our pre-show, one of the first things we talked about is what y'all are doing. What are we doing? And just share notes. And we do that. I think we all three know we're not judging each other in that area. We're just kind of curious to see, and maybe we can learn something to do better. in result of that. Phil and I had a conversation with a good friend of ours yesterday about those same things for about an hour about what can we do better? What can we improve? Those kind of things. Sometimes, though, if we're not careful, those conversations all revolve around, well, did you hear what they're doing? And they're doing it this way. And boy, look at what they're doing. Or it's, well, those guys they're not meeting at all. Or they think a virtual online study is a way they can do this. And we all know, so we have, if we're not careful, there's these really negative kind of things that can creep in, and that competitive, that jealousy, that strife. What Paul describes here is behaving in this letter, behaving like mere men. That's what he describes that is, jealousy and strife, behaving like mere men. If we're not careful, we still do that today, even congregationally based. And that's just something for us to kind of think about as we kind of go. And I know we're almost out of time, so Phil, throw your timeline up and get to the last
Well,
point.
timeline, we're just going to talk through it real quick. It's probably easier that way, because I think the timeline does become important because it establishes some of the signposts in the dialogue that we can use to understand and unbox parts of 1 Corinthians, parts of 2 Corinthians. Most of what I'm going to talk about now is, please understand that it's a bit of a range. Some of the stuff with dating these events are guesstimates. We know some signposts pretty accurately, but with dating events in the ancient Near East, it's always a bit of guesswork. Even when you get down to a concrete that happened this year, it's relative to other events. So just think of it more, it happened in the decade, even when we give you a specific year marker. So around 51 AD, Acts 18, Paul is introduced primarily to these brethren. He's like Chris has already mentioned, on his second tour or missionary tour of preaching and sharing the gospel. He's awaiting Timothy and Silas to strengthen the church in Philippi and Thessalonica. That's Acts 17 range. And he stays there for about 2 years. And so he builds relationships. In 2 years, you build relationships, that have lasting impact on you. And so he builds those relationships, eventually making it back to Judea, Acts 18, 19 or so. And so that sets the backstory, if you will, for his willingness to write letters to them. Inside the text of 1 Corinthians, there's at least 2 correspondence references that take place. One here in the first few chapters, he's heard it from. Another one appears 1 Corinthians 7, verse 1. He mentions some vague terminology about some questions, letters that take place aside from Chloe's people. So there is connection that takes place at a deeper level than just, I was there, I've heard rumors. It's there, I've heard conversations. Because when we say letters, I want you to think about, at least from my perspective, that means they've been talking. He wrote, they responded, they wrote, he responded, etc. is the concept there. And so that stretches our possible range there. Let's say somewhere between AD 51 moving up to 55, 56. The latest maybe is 59 for all of this to take place. So in this 10-year period, think about how much you have changed in 10 years. Throw up a 10-year photo. I've had 2 or more assistants here. I'd have photos of all of us from 10 years ago and say, here's my illustration. Here's what we looked like. Here's what we are now. Corinth has changed from the day that Paul arrived to the day he writes to them. And so the reason those dates are important, not so much that we can fit it on the skeleton of biblical history, but really so we can understand that this is not just a one and done relationship. It's a boom. We're integrated spiritually. Like Tim points out, the relationship of Christians should exceed the idea that it's a Sunday, Wednesday thing. That's really the dessert in the relationship. The relationship should be built on the meat, if you will, of the day-to-day meetings and interactions that we can have. So that gives us kind of a lot of details there, a lot of math we could play with. We've already also kind of covered some of this too, anecdotally in the earlier parts. But Chris, what else did you want to highlight, at least for everyone to think more about?
Yeah, my signal's not super great, so I missed a little bit of your speech there in the middle. But I did think it would be helpful for people to mark some dates that we do know. If you're studying through the book of Acts, you're trying to put together the pieces, I would give you 3 dates that we just keep marked so we can always work off of them. A little earlier than our story, but in chapter 12, in Acts chapter 12, And in verse 23, we have the death there of Herod, and we know that that was 44 AD. It's likely, it's a decent guess that through history that it's 44 AD. So you always mark that. And then you get to our chapter that we're studying, Acts chapter 18. And in verse 12, you have the case where it's about 51 to 52 AD. I'm in Acts 18, verse 12, where Gallio was proconsul of Achaia. So you can kind of write over there, 51, 52. And that's how Phil's coming up with the early end. And then, of course, you can go all the way over to 24, 27. When you get to chapter 24 and verse 27, and Felix is succeeded by Pontius Festus, you can put 60 AD there. So it gives us that 44 AD in chapter 12, 51, 52 in chapter 18, and then 60 in chapter 24. Phil's right. There's a lot of swinging back and forth in terms of how long the journeys were and where he was, but it just gives you some place markers so you can keep it in its relative perspective and use it in the way that he just did. Look at how many years this church had to grow and their change over time.
Terry? You trying to get muted all of a sudden? Did you mute yourself?
I was muted. I did mute myself. Sorry. One of the things I thought about today too, while we were saying it was, I know
I could do that.
Prayer. Yeah. We just left James where it was talking about the Jews who were scattered. And one of the things that's interesting is just to think about this church as a kind of delayed result of the people James was written to, which I think is interesting just to connect all that together. That we talked about how the scattering forced the gospel to spread. And here we are in another region outside of Corinth that is a beneficiary of what happened to those folks that James was writing to. And just to make those connections and to see how all that works together. I think it's just interesting to point that out as well. But look forward to a great study, and really appreciate Chris joining us today. And I thought we had a really good discussion. And I think there was a couple of comments that we maybe didn't get to specifically, but all the comments are great, and just appreciate that so much.
So we're going to go around the horn in just a second. Like Terry, I want to thank Chris for being here. That was excellent. Especially the extra precision of the details on marking the text. I know that's a big thing that you're really invested in. It's a great study tool. Visually connecting the various word repetitions and the structures in the scriptures is really important. And then making your own notes as to kind of tie back is a great learning methodology. All of us have different strengths and weaknesses there, and but putting that physical labor in it really helps things stick. And I appreciate that work that you're doing there quite a bit. So around the horn, we'll go with Chris first. Last comment, shouting things are important coming up. Encouragement and advice to the believers. We've got 40-ish people who joined us today. So really exciting to encourage some folks this way.
A couple things. Really thankful to get to join. I've been trying to catch you guys in this program when I can. I love what you're doing. Enjoyed the work in James, and I think this is going to be great as well. I think that mainly people just need to read. If you're tuned into this and you know that it's going to be 1 Corinthians chapters 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, don't come into a Bible study where you know what it's going to be about, not having read it. Do some reading. Of course, I love color Bible marking. Always kind of look at it in levels. Level 1 is just read the text, enjoy the text, then go back and start to color Bible mark things that maybe jump out at you and make notes. But you will get a lot more out of what these two men and their guests are doing if you just put in the work and do some reading on your own. I really enjoyed this. Love what you guys are doing, and thanks for letting me participate.
Awesome. Terry?
Just thanks again, Chris, for joining. You guys haven't downloaded Excel Still More just from any podcast platform. And then, like he said, he's really starting to offer some stuff on the color marking. And Chris, how do you get a hold of the videos for that? Is that on your Lindell page, or where are you putting those up, the videos for the color marking stuff?
Color Bible marking is going to be on YouTube. There is a Facebook page. It's been around for a little while because I did a bunch of videos a couple of years ago. Color Bible marking, you just like the page, and then all of the uploads to the YouTube, the connections will be there. Also, you can go to LindaleChurchofChrist.com. There's a big box that says Color Bible marking. We have a whole bunch of videos and workbooks and stuff from a couple of years ago. So, if you're looking for a way to get in, there are a bunch of little short videos that kind of walk you through how to get started.
Right.
Yeah. And just something maybe if you want to, you got lots of time on your hands right now, probably something that we'd encourage you to check out. I know that's really beneficial for a lot of folks, and I appreciate your work in that area too. So hopefully, Chris, before too long, it's been a while, we can catch up again and have you back on. Just thanks for joining us today. And just before pass it off to Phil, hope everybody's doing well, staying safe. I know this is still kind of difficult. Phil and I laughed. I think I forget what day we're on that this is gone, but it's about 4 weeks, I think. And hopefully we'll end soon. But until then, just keep serving the Lord and serving other people until that time comes.
Yeah, I want to thank both of you guys for being here, all those who listened. Michael Walls will be with us on Monday to open up 1 Corinthians chapter 1, who works with the congregation in Killeen, Texas. I've known him for a long time. He made a little side comment that he's quite certain that my mom saw the blemishes in both of us, and that's accurate. My mom kind of adopted Michael in some ways as an extra one of her kids, and Mike seems to have adopted her as an extra mom early on. And so while my mom was with us, she was able to see through the veneer of what we presented and see the real us. And so we were blessed for that.
You are both examples of grace.
Yeah, for sure. For sure. As we've been doing, I want to encourage everyone to know a couple things. One, know that God is seeking for you, and we want to encourage you to seek him. If we can help you in some way, please let us know. He has blessed mankind and will continue to bless us. He's opened up the opportunity for us to receive every spiritual blessing, and we tend to close this way, so I want to close this way again. May every endeavor you're engaging in be something that's honorable to God, and may God bless you.